and we'll try to have about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A. If you want to tweet, which I guess we encourage you to do, the hashtag is #TFF. That's kind of a no-brainer. So we're here to talk today about a landmark project about a landmark. And this is not just any landmark. It is arguably the most important, the most visited, the most sacred, the most misunderstood place in Texas. The Alamo, as you know, is best remembered for the battle that was fought there in 1836 between the Mexican army and a vastly outnumbered force of insurgent Texans, or Texians as they were called back then. But the Alamo has a 300-year history going back to 1718, and it was where it was established as Mission San Antonio de Valero. It was moved a couple times to its present location in 1724. And what we're talking about today will be very much a part of that history. We're talking about something that the city of San Antonio, the Texas General Land Office, and the nonprofit Alamo Endowment have joined forces to do, and that is to come up with a master plan for preserving and redeveloping and reinterpreting the Alamo site in the heart of San Antonio. We're going to talk about the details of this project and why it's needed in a minute, but I'd like to introduce the three people who are helping to make it happen here. On my left, immediate left, is Senator José Menéndez. Senator Menendez was the former city councilman in San Antonio, a former Democratic representative for House District 124. I'm right about that, right? And during his time as a state representative, he served on the Powerful Appropriations Committee and chaired the House Committee on Defense and Veterans Affairs, where he passed one of the state's largest mental health programs for veterans. In February of last year, he won a special election for state senator for District 26, the senatorial district that comprises or encompasses San Antonio and the Alamo, and we think one other mission, right? Maybe Mission Concepcion. Senator Menendez was a key leader in securing $25 million from the legislature for this master plan, as well as $5 million for the lots of overdue structural work and improvements on the present Alamo facility. And he was a Senate sponsor of a bill that laid the groundwork for this cooperative agreement we're talking about today. To his left is George P. Bush. George P. Bush has been a public school teacher in Miami, an officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve serving in Afghanistan, a businessman, oil man, an attorney, and since January of 2015, the commissioner of the Texas General Land Office. Last year, the GLO took over the management of the Alamo from the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, which is the volunteer group that had operated the site since 1905. Commissioner Bush is the chair of the board of directors of the Alamo Endowment, and he and San Antonio Mayor Ivy Taylor make up the executive committee that will be seeing the whole Alamo project. Is that correct? It's a really complicated set of things.
More like a veto right, but I'll take that as well.
Okay. And then to his left is Phil Collins, and well, you know, he's Phil Collins. I noticed that in the
You're too kind.
I noticed that in the capsule description in the program, he is described as a musician and Alamo enthusiast. I think those are both underwhelming descriptions. You know, Phil is one of the great musical icons of our age. The former lead singer and drummer of Genesis, and a solo artist, an incomparable solo artist who has sold what I think 200 million records the last time we talked. I don't know, probably many more since
Building
then.
an extension on my garage
Yeah, right.
to keep all these records that I bought.
7 Grammys. And the reason he's here, I mean, I know the reason you're here is probably because of him, but the reason he's here is because improbably and felicitously, he is the world's leading private collector of Alamo artifacts and documents. I had the opportunity when I was writing an article for American History magazine to go to Switzerland and hang out with Phil and see his collection, which was just amazing. And just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff that's in it, you probably all know the famous February 25th letter that Travis wrote from the Alamo. It says, "Victory or death, we will never surrender or retreat." Every school child reads this letter. Well, there's a postscript in that letter that says, P.S. the Lord is on our side. We just gotten 20 or 30 head of beeves into the Alamo. Phil has the receipt for those cattle that Travis bought from a guy named Ignacio Perez in San Antonio de Bejar. So it's an amazing collection, and he has given it to the state of Texas to create a museum. So we're going to talk about this this master plan sometime in late November. The design firm of Preservation Design Partnership is going to present the first draft of a master plan, which will detail their recommendations for the physical rebooting of the Alamo site. This is not going to be an easy task. Texans have been saying, remember the Alamo since 1836 when it was used as a battle cry at San Jacinto. But exactly what we're supposed to be remembering has long been a subject of confusion and controversy. And that confusion extends to the Alamo itself, beginning with the idea that, that this is the Alamo. This is merely the church of the Alamo, which was a 3-acre mission compound. And it looked much different back in the days of 1836. This is a painting that was done by an American officer in the Mexican War named Edward Everett in 1847. As you can see, the Alamo didn't have its sort of Taco Bell facade back then and was a much different looking place. This is a painting, I hope you can see this, by Gary Zaboli, someone Phil knows well. Didn't he do a couple illustrations for your book,
Oh, yeah.
The Alamo and Beyond? This is what the Alamo complex looked like in 1836 during the battle. This is the church right here, which is what we saw in the earlier photos. This is what is called the Long Barracks or Convento, which is still exists. Everything else is gone. These walls on the west side of the Alamo are now, well, I'll show you. This is a kind of, it takes a minute to reorient yourself on this, but this is the, sorry, the pointer's not, oh yeah, this is the Alamo Church. This is the convent I was talking about, the Long Barracks. This is the western, what used to be the western wall. And so this area here in present day is the Alamo footprint. These are a few pictures I took a week or so ago. This is what's on what used to be the west wall of the Alamo. Various things like this, various businesses, and these buildings are in themselves historic buildings that were built in the 19th century, I guess, and early 20th. But as you can see, it's not exactly the sort of historical, interpretation that we might need to be talking about. So I just want to give you a little bit of grounding in that. And before we talk about the project that's underway, I'd like to, I'm going to get rid of that picture. Sorry. I'd like to ask, beginning with you, Senator Menendez, a more personal question, which is, what the Alamo means to you. You grew up, I'm assuming, Mexican-American in San Antonio. So it might be a complicated place for you and for, what it means.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, my mom is an immigrant from Mexico, and my uncles and my aunts, she's the one that came to the U.S. Most of her family still stayed in northern Mexico. And I would hear from them all the time. They would actually give me a hard time about how we lost at the Alamo, and they would, just kind of kid me, and it was the oddest thing because, growing up in school in San Antonio, whether people know what your ancestry is or not, if you have any Hispanic heritage, you're a Mexican, but when you go to visit your cousins in Mexico on my mom's side, you're a gringo, because I don't speak every single word exactly perfect. And so, and they want to, just kind of ride you a little bit about Texas and Texas taking or the U.S. taking Texas, all these things. And so it was somewhat difficult, but I think growing up, to me, I always held on to the notion that, you know, what's beautiful about the Alamo, it's that's where the movement, the earnest cementing the foundation, the strengthening of the movement for our independence as what we ended up becoming a nation for a while. And I love the story of how it was people from all walks of life, that there were people of Mexican descent, that there were Indians, that there were Texans, there were people from Tennessee, there were people from all walks of life in that Alamo fighting for one cause. And that they were given a choice, that they weren't drafted. They had a choice. They could have left, but they chose to meet certain death. And there's such a wonderful sentiment of just courage and perseverance and determination, and that it is a great source of pride. But obviously it does have some mixed emotions in the sense, not necessarily of mixed loyalties, but just of the fact of our history and how intertwined our history is really with Mexico, and that we just need to be, I think the best respect we can pay everyone is to be honest about the history.
Speaking of being intertwined with history, Commissioner, you have a Mexican mother and a Texas-born father, and you were born in Houston. So what is your experience of the Alamo? Is it as complex as the Senators?
Well, from my standpoint, it's more of a historic perspective. I've always been an admirer of history, love the unique feature of the past battles of Texas. I mean, I love military history, served in the military myself. And when you look at the Alamo, just on the surface alone, the Battle of 1836 provides the tourist an incredible and compelling experience. I think the opportunity for this, reimagining the Alamo master plan, is for us to take that to another level, to speak to who we are as a people, as Texans, as the Senator points out. The Alamo can be a centerpiece for taking on the controversial issues of the past, whether it's slavery, whether it's Mexican control of Mexican Texas, Spanish crown control. You know, so for a student of history, I find that to be intriguing, and that's what draws me to this issue, other than just being your land commissioner and being the day-to-day manager. But I think it's important and an incredible educational opportunity for future generations.
Yeah. And Phil, you're kind of the odd man out because you grew up in England.
Thank you.
And,
Wonderful introduction.
And you had the longest journey to Alamo fandom of anybody I know.
Yeah. Well, you know, in England, when I was growing up, 5 or 6 years old, we had a little black and white television in the corner of the room. And one day, you know, we turned it on, and there was King of the Wild Frontier was on with Fess Parker, and there's something about him and his tassel jacket and things, you know, that appealed to me. 5 or 6 years old. But when he went to this place, which was, you know, the Alamo, and the impression I got, the memories I have of my impressions at that time, were that this group of people were going, and they knew they were going to die, but they went, or they were there. You know, I mean, Crockett went, but they kind of, there was something very noble and very, you know, romantic in a way, and very, I know that just moved me as a 5 or 6 year old, and from that moment I was, you know, obsessed. I used to draw the facade, you know. Played it, cowboys and Indians, or Mexicans and Texans, you know. It was, I think, and as I've gotten older, I've started to, I mean, the last 25 years, I've read every book I can, and I found out a lot more, that it wasn't quite as black and white as that it was portrayed by Hollywood, certainly Walt Disney, and then John Wayne's over-romanticized film, beautiful though it was, with wonderful music. You know, I've learned that it wasn't quite as black and white as, and that's one of the things I think would be good in this day and age, which you've referred to, Senator, that you know, we put it into context that there were brave men on both sides of the walls, you know, and the grey stuff, the grey bits that make up the real story. So that's what I'm very keen on, you know, hoping that this master plan will do, because there are a lot of prejudices that still exist, and in this day and age, when we're, you know, talking about Charlotte and everything, it all needs to be much more, you know, addressed and put into perspective, I think. But it's a wonderful place, and I'm totally obsessed by it now. And the collection has gone to Texas, the Alamo, and I'm still collecting, and that will eventually go as well. So.
I remember you told me once the first time you saw the Alamo, it was like meeting the Beatles.
Yeah. Well, it was, you know, I mean, at the time when I first came here in in San Antonio in 1973, there was me and Peter Gabriel and our tour manager, and we had a day off each. We had three or 4 days off, and we chose somewhere to go. Each of us chose somewhere to go. I said, I got to go to the Alamo. So, and you could drive, you could turn right at the Alamo Plaza, you know, yeah. And the Alamo was on my left. And the first time I saw that, it was you know, it was a wonderful experience for me. Mm-hmm. And it still is. I go there, as you know, quite often, and I still go to visit, and I still walk around the grounds, and I still think, well, that happened there, and that happened there, and I'm kind of in love with it, you know.
Go ahead.
I would like to invite you to a ceremony that happens once a year. Back in the mid-90s, when there was an excavation, they were looking to see what was buried underneath. They found some bones, and they looked in the rosters, and they saw who was buried, and there were some Native American families. And so the descendants of those Native Americans, once a year, have a sunrise prayer ceremony in the Alamo. And I want to thank the commissioner for helping make sure that that still happens to honor their descendants. And it's one of the most moving experiences. And it's just maybe 20, 30 people.
The descendants of the defendants.
Of the Native Americans who were buried at sunrise. And many of them dressed in the traditional garb. Yeah. And it's and then they go for a run. But it's a very moving experience. And it's something that it's unlike anything. And if you can imagine, you know,
well, that's the kind of thing that most people, and I think George, who's the master planner, you know,
right here,
has been battling with this, is that everybody knows of 1836, you know, but there's such a history before, which mustn't be ignored, and I know that we discussed at the endowment meeting that I was present at that there are ceremonies, you know, and the Indian family, you know, the Indian. The tribes, you know, the ceremonies should carry on. You know? I mean, it's before it was 1836. You know, the Alamo. Remember the Alamo? It was you know, a mission built to educate the Indians, and it was an Indian burial ground. You know, It's got such a lot of history.
Commissioner, can you walk us through the history of this project? How it began, how you got involved with it, and you know, where it's going.
Well, very briefly, when I came into office, a management agreement that was signed by my predecessor with the Daughters of the Republic of Texas was scheduled to expire. And just as a quick reminder, then Attorney General Greg Abbott in 2010 conducted an audit on the financial management of the Alamo, of the Daughters, and it was a fairly scathing report. It resulted in the legislature in 2011 to hand over the custodianship to the Texas General Land Office. Yeah. So I had to make a tough decision early on in my term, and I made the decision we needed to go in a different direction. One of the first things that I did was put together a board to handle the day-to-day management. It is composed of 9 Texans, most of whom are San Antonian. Gene Powell, the former chairman of the UT Board of Regents. I'm not sure we have any board members here this morning. We also have Gene Powell, Red McCombs, who's a business titan, of course, in San Antonio, and Gene Powell and Ramona Bass, among others. And so we're excited about the philanthropic capacity of the board. But one of the first things that they wanted to commission was conducting a global search for a master planner to help us reimagine the experience. And I'm pleased to welcome George Skarmeas, who's the owner of PDP. And he comes to us from Philadelphia, who, and among other projects, helped to restore Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the U.S. Supreme Court, D.C., Monticello, and Virginia. We conducted a very exhaustive search, and I encourage each and every one of you to meet him this morning if you have any follow-up detailed questions on the master plan. Right now, we are in the second phase of a 5-phase master plan, where we will open to the public on a transparent basis options and designs for how to restore that original footprint that you showed earlier on one of your slides. Because that's one of our goals, is to bring authenticity to the visitor experience, historic credibility, and reversibility to any construction that takes place. And so George will be commissioning those designs at the end of November. I encourage you to check out reimaginethealamo.org, a website that we've stood up to communicate with the public. We have Facebook, Twitter, I don't know about Instagram, but we have all the social media platforms there to communicate with the public.
And the state has bought those three buildings on the west side of the plaza. The Woolworth building, the Crockett building,
yeah.
and the Palace building, right? So there were three, where the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum and all that kind of stuff is. Those,
correct.
The state will own those.
We are the landlords of that beautiful slide that you saw earlier. But we do honor contractual commitments, and those leases are fairly long-term, and they're unbreakable. Mm-hmm. So in that instance, and we're very open and honest in terms of our conversations with merchants and in the vicinity, and I happen to be a small businessman myself, but I think even business owners in the area recognize the need for more historic deference to the battlefield site. For those of you who may have visited Gettysburg or other famous battle sites here in the U.S., you'll notice that there's an immediate sense of deference, and that's what we're trying to create, but in a non-confrontational way.
Commissioner, my understanding is, though, that the businesses that are in the area, if somehow, I don't want to add responsibility to anybody, but if somehow a solution for their relocation would be able to come up, that they're open to that, therefore would be willing to be a party to amending those contracts that they have. Even though they have a contract, they'd be willing to do so. Is that correct?
That's our understanding right now, Senator, is that, and they've been more than flexible. They want to be a part of the process, and we've engaged them. It's not acrimonious by any means.
Right.
So we're optimistic.
Yeah. What was the process like of getting this through the legislature? Is there bipartisan agreement on this thing?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You gave me a lot of credit, but as soon as I saw Phil in the back room, I thanked him. He should be listed as my joint author on the bill. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the legislative process, obviously that is, as the name entails, someone who helps you get the legislation through. What I love about the Alamo and what I love about San Antonio, and people say it in many speeches, is that when we're welcoming people to San Antonio, you know, please consider it your second home. And mostly everyone who comes to San Antonio feels so welcome. But for people who have anything to do with Texas history or government, everyone feels that the Alamo is a part of the state. And so yes, it's located in San Antonio, but it's where our honest, earnest definition for our independence started. You know, that's why we call it the cradle of Texas liberty. And Phil came to the Capitol last session, and he was gracious enough to take lots of selfies and sign lots of autographs and hang out in a lunch with a lot of elected officials. And I think that after they heard Phil's story, much like we heard it just a few minutes ago, even though they had a sense, it's unfortunate. Sometimes when something's in your own backyard, you don't pay as much attention to it. You don't think of it as much. But Phil sort of refocused that for a lot of people. And so it was not as hard as anybody might think. The issue was how much. And we were able to agree that we needed the $5 million because of the crumbling foundation, the ceiling issues. We needed an emergency amount of money, and the commissioner had that on his list of what he needed to get the place up and running. He had all the bids. But some of the leadership in the Senate were very clear with me, and this is what I love to hear. They said, we're going to entrust you with this. We've agreed. But don't go out and get a low bid, shoddy workmanship. And so that's what's so important about the national search that led us to George. Because George, having worked on the Supreme Court, having worked on Independence Hall, having worked on being a world-renowned restorer of historic places, that's what we need. Because I feel bad. I mean, shortly after my election, I took a group of neighborhood leaders, presidents and stuff, to tour the city, my district, and the Alamo was one of our stops. I couldn't tell you how many of them were like, oh, we hadn't been here in years. Oh, is that it? And it was a feeling like they got off the bus and they fought traffic to get across the street. We literally had to stop traffic. It just didn't have that feeling of an Independence Hall, of a Gettysburg. And we have to find a way, regardless of where you come from, to your reverence for the Alamo. I really don't care what originates your feeling of concern and care for this piece of history. What I want to have happen is that every child has an opportunity to really get the importance of what this place was and where it stands in our history. I mean, it's almost like getting to watch the birthplace of a great, state. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to see it given that respect that it deserves.
Well, one of the elements of that will, of course, be Phil's collection. Yep. And the master plan is yet to be unveiled or even presented in a draft form. But Phil, do you have a sense of how you would like your stuff to be shown?
Yeah, I visited. I don't upset anybody, I hope. But as an Englishman, I feel I can tread more dangerously than some, I started to think about what was going to happen, in your affairs. And someone said to me, my accountant said to me, "What are you going to do with the Alamo collection?" And I said, "Well, it should go to a museum." I mean, my youngest child, Matthew, kind of was a little upset because I think he's followed this. He can name all the people involved in that particular San Jacinto and Goliad and the Alamo. But so I went to see, I thought a couple of museums. So I came to San Antonio, visited a couple of museums, and it's like I went into one of them, and I don't need to mention the name, but it was very pristine, lots of glass, lots of chrome. Things were arranged very neatly, and it didn't seem it didn't seem to be what I wanted or what I imagined. I did come to the Bullock Museum here, and they did have some exhibits which were, in the dirt. They had some pictures behind to put it into context. And I think that's what I would like to see. And I think everybody, George and, we've met a few times over the last couple of days, and we're agreed on getting that kind of feel, I think. It's still up for grabs, but I just would like to, we found, I've collected a lot of things that were standalone items, but I've also collected lots of buttons, lots of small things that were personal to Mexican soldiers or the defenders. And I think it would be nice to show those pieces rather than most museums put them in boxes and you never see them. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be nice to show most of the collection, if not all of it. That was one of my stipulations, and I said to Jerry Patterson, who was your predecessor, that I didn't want it to be in boxes. Otherwise, I'll keep it,
mm-hmm.
and put it out at home,
right.
so I can see it. There's no point in having this stuff in boxes. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I'd like it all to be displayed, and I'd like it to be displayed in context. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably what will happen. And I'm going to be involved in how it's displayed at some point when it gets to that moment. But you know, believe me, from being a 5 or 6 year old who loved the whole story, and that the only story I knew at that time was the story we were all fed by Hollywood. But to sit here now with these gentlemen and yourself, you know, who we know each other very well, and you know, to be sitting here talking about something that's involved with this place that I started loving when I was 5 or 6 years old, you know, is quite extraordinary for me. So I'm very proud to be here and very proud to put my collection at the hands so that people can see it, because it was in my basement in Switzerland, in museum cases I had built, but you know, no one ever saw it apart from me. And now people will be able to come and see it, and I think that's a great thing, that people will be able to enjoy it. You know,
I think the Alamo is I think the Alamo is a somewhat unique historical site, and George Scarmaeus, I'm sure you understand this idea too. The Alamo was not begun, but it was given to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas in 1905 to operate by the state of Texas as a shrine. And there's a very deep at the base of the Alamo story is a myth of noble self-sacrifice, and it's even today it's regarded as a shrine. You know, there's a sign on the front of the Alamo Church telling gentlemen to remove their hats. And they're really serious about that. I mean, you leave your hat off when you go into the Alamo. So is there, you know, I just sort of like to ask each of these questions. I don't know where it would go, but is there a tension between the idea of the Alamo as a sacred space and an historical site, and can that gap be bridged by this plan we're talking about?
I'd like to start, if it's okay.
Sure.
I think that constructive tension is positive. I think that tension means people care. When people don't care, they just ignore. So I like that, and I think the Alamo is enough of an important place to have phases. And I think the chapel, as a place where religious ceremonies, where burials, where weddings, where important rituals have been, I think that should be a sacred place. But I think you have more on those grounds to be able to expand. I think the chapel itself should be sort of recognized as what it was, and then as we do the master plan, we have opportunities to lay out the pieces. And it might be an opportunity, as however it goes forward, to maybe for pieces that where a soldier's hat or gun or rifle, whatever, laid out was where the wall used to be, and maybe he fell there or something, that you could put them out in a way that as you come, it doesn't take just 8 to 10 minutes, which the average visitor spends today, that you could actually have to experience what it was like. And then you have a few stories. You have the very important battle of 1836 that so many people have written to me, and particularly from out of state, worried that we're trying to rewrite history. And I mean, there's nothing to that. No one wants to rewrite history. We want history plus. We want the whole history. And therefore, there's an opportunity to say, and this is where agriculture took place, and this is where other things happened, that could be something that adds to it, because I think your collection and other things that we'll find will tell a broader story.
Yeah. I mean, I started collecting, when I started collecting, my kind of blinkered view was just to get things related to the Alamo. You know, I wasn't interested in anything else. And slowly I became aware of what led to it, you know, before that, and what came from it. So the collection grew in, you know, it's still, you know, I know you're doing a book on Texas, but I mean, you know, this is like a little umbrella underneath a huge umbrella. And so that's what I started collecting. And I think, I mean, two things. There was talk from Gary Foreman, for example, about almost like, rebuilding, And I think that's just going to end up like a movie set, But people come here, or come to San Antonio, sorry, people come to see the Alamo because of what they know about it. But the thing is to sort of, I think, being in a band, and constructing a song set, you tease people, you can't just play lots of new things because they don't know it, and people like what they know. So you place songs in a certain way to gain their enthusiasm and to gain their trust, and then you hit them with something new. Then you go back to something. So, you don't think about this, psychological warfare. I'm sorry. But it's the way you end up winning an audience, and I think that's the similar kind of thing that we have to do with the way, if you lay out a whole, 50, 100 years of history before 1836, some people are going to glaze over. I mean, and although there's lots of interesting stuff in there, you've got to play games with them, and I think that's the way it can work best. In terms of a museum.
Commissioner, do you have any sense of the wrong way to do this? I mean, in terms of like bridging the gap we're talking about. I mean, and I guess another question related to that is what kind of pushback do you get from people? Senator mentioned that he was, that there were people who were saying that you're going to ruin it, and there is a kind of mom and pop funkiness to the Alamo as it is that some people might miss. I mean, how do you incorporate all these constituencies, these kind of nostalgic constituencies into this place?
Well, first, if I could say, I agree with the center. I think that's what makes history so special, at least in my heart, is the tension. So, for example, our group had a chance to travel to Independence Hall, and George, as I mentioned before, was involved in that project. How do you tell the story of slave quarters in the vicinity of Independence Hall, where 100 years before that, the drafters were working on important documents such as the Declaration of the Constitution? And how do you square that? So I can't think of anything more difficult and more complicated than that storytelling. And for those of you that may have had a chance to visit it, there's a deference. That great things and documents were drafted, but there's also a story with respect to post-colonial era. And that's what we're attempting to do. I just want to make it clear, this isn't about me, and it's not going to be about the three panelists on the stage in the master planning process. We're fully engaging the public's opinion, but with eyes wide open, knowing that we have to prioritize what brings people. The senator also mentioned that, and it's similar to the experience of our COO, who formerly ran the 9/11 Memorial. When he would welcome millions of tourists to Ground Zero and to the museum itself, he noticed that whether it was relatives of somebody who had lost a loved one in 9/11 or somebody who came from the Middle East, that everybody has their own interpretation, their own connection to the visit itself. And so, I fully recognize that it's going to be the biggest challenge we encounter when we develop the museum and visitor center. One final point, and this is an important timeline for us, is that the contractual agreement the state of Texas has with Phil is that we have to have substantial completion toward a permanent demonstration of his collection, which is world-recognized private collection. So we are now in year 6, unless you're willing to amend that agreement. We have 6 years left, so this will be a challenge, but that's why we welcome the public, your engagement, your thoughts, and feedback as we move forward in phase 2.
That timeline's also constructive tension. I think we should we need to have that timeline to keep a little pressure on us. One thing that we have not mentioned that's important that say, and he almost deserves a seat, he does deserve a seat as well. former city councilman who, while on city council, worked very hard to start the city's interest in renewing the Alamo space, and now State Representative Diego Bernal. He was a great partner in making this legislation pass through the House as well, and has remained very active and vigilant as well. And so I need to give him a shout out because he's worked hard from his days on at City Council and now as a state rep, and he continues to be fully engaged as well.
And by the way, the $31 million-ish appropriated by the legislature.
31.5 million.
31.5.
But who's counting?
That is not the cost of this thing.
No.
That is like the beginning, the startup money. And so you guys are going to have to raise, or we are, as citizens, are going to have to raise a ton of money to make this happen. So just beware.
In my legislative appropriation request, I've gone big. I've asked for $75 million. And that was a historic appropriation, and we recognize with a tighter budget, it will be a more difficult ask. But as part of that, I'm also informing legislators that the private sector will be a part of this. If you include Phil's collection, which we can estimate what the value of that is, the city's commitment of $17 million, they have a bond package going to voters this November, in addition to the state's past but hopefully future contribution. I mean, we're looking at a 9-digit number to make this happen. But I think most people recognize that we have to do this. And one other, and you touched on this before, is that in 2024 we will reach the 300th anniversary of the construction of the church, and so that is a deadline that we're all seeking to pursue as well.
We have time for questions from the audience. Is any? I can't see very well. Are there microphones here or not?
There's folks right here.
Yes, sir. I don't know if there are microphones, but go ahead and.
It looks like Bob Rivard. Is that you, Bob? It's hard to see with the lights in our face.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
There are microphones.
Well, we could have carpooled from San Antonio.
Good morning, great panel. 2 questions. Congressman Doggett inserted some language into the 2017 appropriations bill urging the General Services Administration to start negotiating with all of you toward the possibility of the Hipolito Garcia Federal Building being turned over and becoming part of the master plan. Obviously, it's a beautiful historic building. It's had a lot of investment in it. It would be a great place for Phil Collins' collection. And a related second question, obviously the litigation did not work out to where the state acquired the daughter's library. It now has a very iffy home in principle with Texas A&M and Bexar County, but why doesn't the state move to purchase that library from the daughters, since they apparently don't have the funds to adequately curate it? Thank you.
If I could address the first question, Congressman Doggett, in addition to Congressman Culberson out of Houston, deserve a lot of credit for helping us behind the scenes with respect to our interactions at the federal level, particularly at the GSA. Little known fact is that the Alamo is actually right within his district, and he represents both Austin and San Antonio and recognizes this is the most important historic landmark he has. And so he joined us last night for a reception honoring Phil, and George Scarmias gave us an update on master plan activities. So we're thankful for his support in terms of the legislation. With respect to...
excuse me, Commissioner, could you tell people what the Hipolito Garcia building is, and just so that we'll have a sense of what we're talking about?
So the Federal Post Office building is located at the northwest location of where the original walls of the compound were located. Regretfully, it's protected by historic code, and there's very little, at least from my rudimentary understanding, of what we can do to redevelop that site or repurpose it. But it's a building that the federal government has actually invested quite a bit of capital into, even as of late. There are federal tenants in there. I think Congressman Cuellar has an office in there. A few members of the state ledge, I believe, as well have an office. It can be utilized for exhibit space, potential administrative space. All options are at the table, on the table right now. But because of our partnerships at the federal level, we're able to utilize that building potentially as a contribution to the master plan.
Because it's right on the north wall of where the Alamo was. Right. Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's on it actually sits in the original footprint, which presents an additional challenge. But
it's haunted too, they tell me. The guards tell me.
It has wonderful mosaics in the inside, and it's a beautiful, beautiful building. With the new federal courthouse actually in San Antonio, there may be some possibilities where some of the federal tenants can reorganize and consolidate in the other building. Sure. So we're constantly in communication with the DRT to look at any and all options. My understanding is that they have their agreement with A&M San Antonio, and we feel confident that the collection is in good stead from a management perspective. But like I said, we're not only opportunistic with respect to real estate in the vicinity of the Alamo, but with respect to historic collections in the area. And just to be clear, the litigation that the daughters pursued against the state was with respect to the contents of as you had mentioned, and that's an important point because a lot of people think that it was over the day-to-day management of the Alamo. And so we're constantly in contact. Now that we're out of our litigation, we can now focus on the bigger picture items that we've discussed today.
I think is there a microphone over there? Or
Yes, sir.
Imagining that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Today, the Alamo is revered and hallowed. The first time I saw it, we were living in San Antonio, and it was like, this is all it, it was like you turn the corner downtown and there it is. Can you address how it went from disregard and all that property being used for other purposes to today where it's, hallowed ground, and, what happened historically where that area just got, hey, it's land, let's put a building here?
Well, as was mentioned in the presentation, the Ripley's buildings, as they are called, were early 20th century construction. They are protected by historic code. And if you look at, and George can visit on this in more detail, you can see overhead imagery of the vicinity of the Alamo over time, and you just see, and it's really contrarian, but we hear when tourists visit the grounds, why is this in the middle of San Antonio? And so, this is the most visited site in the state of Texas, 1.7 million visitors. We hear just about everything. But that's going to be one of the challenges we face. And I think but there's other case studies here in the country where foundations and state governments have come together to reimagine that experience, create more of a sense of deference. So there are complications. I'd mentioned the lessees that we have, the Ripleys, but we're in constant contact in terms of alternatives for them.
My question was more about that interim period. I mean, if it's hallowed ground and it was a pivotal point in Texas history between 1836 and the early 19th century, it was just another place?
Well, it helps sometimes to look at very old photographs. And when I've done that, when I've looked at very old photographs, and you'll see some stables right next to the chapel, and you'll see the Menger Hotel right, and you'll see that. I mean, you got to remember too, we lost, right? So one of the things that I find interesting is not a lot of places honor where they had a tremendous loss or tragedy. Okay, typically you try to remember your big victories. What I think is really important is that we've matured as a state. We've grown up to accept what happened as a turning point in our history. I think there was a time where the city was growing and people were trying to go on with commerce, and it was just the center of the city. And I think we can't be responsible for the mistakes of the past. What I love is that here we have a gentleman who's come from England to tell us the story about how this moved him as a child to collect for his whole adult life, and that it's so important that he's probably one of many examples, and that we need to try to impart that same type of reverence on our own citizens, our own people here in our state, to understand what had happened there, so that then they might get interested in what happened at the Battle of San Jacinto and Goliad. His son probably knows more than most of our kids in our schools here, and that's a shame. And so I think that I'm so glad to have them working in partnership with the rest of the members of the legislature, because I want us to understand our history so that we can better understand ourselves better, who we are. And I think in doing so, we will live better in peace. And at the very beginning, Phil said something about there has been a lack of authenticity, a lack of being just genuine and honest with each other. And the more we do that with each other, the easier it is for us to get along, because we understand each other better.
I think I just also think that the city is, I mean, there are very few battle sites, if you like, in the middle of a town. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that the town grew up around it and has kind of encroached upon the compound and the footprint, but you know, the only other one I can think of is the Tower of London in England, where you know you still have the walls from medieval, you know, from the earliest.
Wow.
But London has grown up around that without actually encroaching upon that area. But most of these battle sites are out of town, or you know, you kind of go to visit, and it's a different thing. Here you've got traffic, and you know, it's you can't really halt the system, but it's a way. It's how you modify it to you know, to entertain the idea of what is trying to be achieved here. You know?
Yeah.
My
Over there.
question is related, but first I just want to set the historical record correct. Senator Menendez, you did not lose at the Alamo, and the children of San Antonio need to remember that.
Well, I don't know which side you're putting me on, but go ahead.
But my question has to do about land value and land use, and that's the controversy with the master plan. I live in San Antonio. All of the missions have been declared World Historical Site. And all of a sudden, the land around the rest of those missions is prime development property. The Alamo is surrounded by hotels and tourist businesses, and that's what's developed naturally. How do we protect those neighborhoods of the South Side, those parishes and active congregations in the missions, and make sure that that development is in keeping with those very close-knit communities and neighborhoods of the South Side, and it doesn't become boutique hotels and luxury condos?
Well, I can't really speak to the other missions development plan, to be very candid with you. With respect to our plan, we're constantly engaging local entrepreneurs, local business owners, all the asset owners. In fact, just this past week, I was in Galveston visiting with 2 such owners in terms of assessing ways in which we can work together. We can do this in a collaborative way where everybody wins. And I think one of the best feedbacks that we've heard, and Becky Denon, who's our executive director at the Alamo, who's boots on ground every single day, is that a lot of local business owners are impressed with the fact that we engage them on a daily basis. And so we're going to do this in a sensible way. We're going to do it in a way where the community benefits and that the community is more engaged than ever, at least with respect to the mission de Valero.
I'm interested to know why you said we didn't lose. Who you
The Mexicans
referring to?
won the battle at the Alamo.
I'm an American.
They didn't lose the war, but they did win that battle.
Yeah,
Right.
the Mexicans won that battle.
I have friends who are Hispanic who take their children to the Alamo and remind them that they did not lose at the Alamo.
No, this is true, but this is what I love about Texans. No matter where you go in the world and you start talking, hey, where are you from? You're visiting stuff. If it's a Texan, the first thing they say, I'm a Texan. Have you noticed that? People don't say, I mean, they go, I'm a Texan. And you know, me and my cousins got into a lot of arguments over this. And the reality is I'm proud of our history. I'm not proud of everything that's occurred, not just, you know, because there's blemishes on every society has had its blemishes, and you talked about slavery, and I think that's one of the big ones, and the biggest that we've had. And so the issue for me is that I just want us to be honest, you know, and I tell my children the same thing I feel. And my parents were immigrants. My mom from Mexico, my dad from Cuba. I was like, look, you're an American of Hispanic descent, you know, and I'm proud of my descent. I'm proud of my Mexican family. I'm proud of my Cuban family. But the fact of the matter is, I am an American, and I'm a Texan, and therefore I view history through that, but I want to be honest about it because I think everybody has a room at the table because I want to be mature enough to say, yeah, I lost there, but guess what? I got you at San Jacinto.
But you're avoiding my question about land use.
I think we have time for one more question.
Planning around the other missions.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question to Phil. With your love of Alamo history and your past as a recording artist and your continuation, I understand you're back recording as well. How much of an influence has Alamo history, Texas history had on you as a recording artist? And then also, as far as your collection, what do you think is probably the piece that you really want to see get a good location within the Alamo to be displayed?
I don't think, I've left writing songs about the Alamo and Texas to other people, They seem to do it much better than I would, and there's a lot of it. So I kind of have kept the two things very separate. I think that one of the things that appealed to me, as I mentioned before, was because, and I, relating to the gentleman before, about winning and losing and who was right, who was wrong, who was the good guys, who were the bad guys. When I was 5 or 6, I was fed who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, by Hollywood. And, but it was the romance of the thing, and I guess in my songwriting, that feeling comes over with a lot of my music. And in fact, on one of my albums, there's a song, and I put a couple of lines by each song as to what that song meant to me. And one of them was to do the right thing, to always try to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And that was why I think that's one of the things that I kind of remember thinking when I saw King of the Wild Frontier, which was these guys were at this place, and they were doing what they thought was right. Yeah. But in terms of the collection, there's so many things, and on any given day I could go down, when I was seeing it every day in my house, I would just go down there to look, grab a book, and each day there would be something that I thought, that's amazing, whether it's the Joe Musso Bowie knife, which he was so convinced was Bowie's. I've got a few other Bowie items, like a sword that was taken at San Jacinto because someone had taken it from him at the Alamo, and they've all got stories. And so any given day it changes. My first thing that I got was a receipt. It was given to me by my wife, and it was the receipt for John W. Smith's saddle. And John W. Smith, I've had a constant fascination with him ever since, because there are no images of him. And he was the first Anglo mayor of San Antonio, and his wife has had a photograph, fearsome looking woman too. But no, really, I mean, women were different in those days. But
we still have some of those here.
There's no images of John W. Smith. I kind of, since that piece, which is just a little receipt for his saddle, and I thought, this guy just 10 days before San Jacinto, a month after the Alamo, had to sell his saddle, and how many miles that saddle had done for Texas and taking messages in and out of the Alamo. So that was a fascinating piece to me. And sometimes, the receipts for the beeves, just little scraps of paper. Mm-hmm. And, but there's so much story behind them. So, it's going to be great that people can see this stuff. I get excited thinking about it.
So we all are, and we're out of time. But thank you all so much for coming here.
Thank you all.
We'll see you soon.